Well, I'm located in the Centre for International Cooperation and Security, which is a research centre within the Department of Peace Studies. And essentially the work that we do in the centre, or KICS as we're called, is really a mixture of the theoretical work on conflict and peace and also applied research. In terms of the applied research, one of the major projects that I'm currently working on is in collaboration with a major European development agency, and we're looking at gender-based violence. And specifically we're looking at how violence against women and young girls changes over the course of a conflict and then through to the beginnings of peace. Because one of the key issues that we tend to find in peace studies is that the beginning of peace doesn't necessarily mean that the structures or the inequalities or the discrimination that created the conflict or perpetuates conflict in the first place are necessarily eliminated. So the current work that we're doing is very much focused on how violence against women changes once the conflict has ended. So specifically we're looking around issues such as sexual violence against women, psychological violence and also physical violence against women and girls in countries that are coming out of conflict and which are in principle moving towards peace. But as I said, one of the main problems that we find is that the violence against the women and girls tends to be structurally embedded and is consequently perpetuated during peacetime. What we try and do with the gender-based violence research project is to engage with the empirical information which is coming out of these countries. We work with partners in the countries to make sure that we have the information coming from the ground, as it were. And essentially what we try and do with that information is write this up into a report form for the donor who's currently employing us on this project, with the aim of making recommendations, or what we call dialogue entry points, for this donor, so that when they are working in the country they know what the key issues are and areas around which they can try and engage with government, civil society, NGOs in that country in order to enhance the position of women and girls and to address the causes and types of violence that women and girls face. So, for example, one of the case studies that we're working on in the gender-based violence, or GBV project, is Guatemala. What we've worked on so far in Guatemala, we've looked at how women and girls were treated during Guatemala's very long, violent and bloody civil war. And what we saw was high levels of violence, which was specifically and deliberately targeted at women because of their gender. It was a kind of violence that was very targeted at the fact that this was women. So what we found, for example, are very high levels of rape, very high levels of sexual violence against women during the Guatemalan conflict. What we then try and do is follow through what's happened in Guatemala since the peace process in that country in the 1990s. And what we're seeing in our work is that the forms and nature of violence are still there in Guatemala. It's just the kind of type of violence has changed. So you have the underlying structural drivers of that violence, which created that kind of environment for violence during the conflict. Those structural drivers are still there. Women, particularly if you're an indigenous woman in Guatemala, or if you're a young girl, they face enormous bias, enormous discrimination in the legal system, throughout the institutional framework of the state, in a highly patriarchal society. So what we're trying to do in our current work is look at and identify what these contemporary forms of violence against women and girls in Guatemala are. And what we're seeing is this perpetuation of high levels of sexual violence and physical brutality against women, both in the home but also outside on the streets. And there are implications that the security forces are simply not prepared to defend women. There are implications that the security forces themselves are somehow involved in this violence. So what we're trying to do for our donor is to, again, identify dialogue points, elaborate for them what kind of violence we're dealing with in Guatemala, and try and ensure that when the donor is engaged on discussions about gender violence in Guatemala, that they're fully informed and that they have a realistic idea of what the most urgent and pressing points are around the gender-based violence agenda. The key thing for donors, which we find in our applied work, is that donors can have incredibly benign intentions. They want to go into a country and they want to try and make the situation better. But sometimes what we find with donors is that if donors don't have a full and realistic appreciation of that country, but also a full and detailed understanding of conflict, then they can actually make interventions which are conflict insensitive. They can actually reignite the conflict, or they can strengthen those factors which in themselves can create conflict. So the way that we approach this work with donors is we try and flag to donors areas around which they need to be very, very sensitive, because in that specific country, cultural or local context, then their ideas of what's progress and what's beneficial for that society or that community might be fundamentally misleading. And we find that in relation to, for example, patriarchy and gender relations in a country. You can have a donor which would go into a country, identify the impoverishment of women as a serious cause of underdevelopment and possible future conflict. The donor could go in with the best of intentions and develop a microcredit program for women. The problem then might be that if you empower women with that kind of financial resources, you create their independence and autonomy, and that can disrupt the social relations within the family. And what you tend to find is a rise in violence against women, which is carried out by the husband, by the male partner, because you've created that imbalance in the family. So you have to be hugely sensitive how you monitor, how you design these interventions, and how you evaluate them. Because really what you're aiming to do here is be as conflict sensitive as possible, addressing these kind of structural violence, structural drivers of violence and poverty, whilst at the same time making sure that you don't create new dangers and new cycles of inequality and exclusion.